Hello and welcome to Real People, Real Lives. I'm Sandy. On this show, we explore the stories of everyday people, their struggles, successes, and the experiences that make them unique. Each episode brings you a fresh perspective from someone with a story to tell. Let's jump in.
This episode contains conversations about trauma, mental health, and the lasting effects of serving others. While these topics may be difficult for some listeners, they're shared with the hope of encouraging, understanding, healing, and reminding anyone who may be struggling that they're not alone. Please take care while listening.
My guest today is Dan Clark, a Marine Corps veteran, former firefighter and paramedic, husband, father, and advocate for mental health awareness. For years, Dan dedicated his life to serving others, first in the Marines, and later on one of the busiest ambulances in the country during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the weight of that service eventually became more than anyone should have to carry alone. In this first of a two-part conversation, Dan shares what led him into public service, the cumulative trauma that first responders often carry, and the moment he realized that he couldn't continue carrying it by himself. His story is honest, powerful, and a reminder that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's one of the bravest decisions we can make. Here's part one of my conversation with Dan Clark. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you telling the story, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. I greatly appreciate you bringing me on here and giving me the opportunity to speak about my life and hopefully make an impact on somebody else.
And I'm sure you will, because this is really a story of not only huge challenges in your life, but coming out on the other side. And I think that's so important for people to understand that we're all facing challenges in life, no matter how big or small. And sometimes someone else's story really can make a difference in our story. So before we talk about some of the more difficult chapters of your life, I would really love for everyone to get to know you and learn about you. Can you tell us more about yourself, maybe where you're from, growing up, what led you to join the Marines, all of that kind of stuff?
Sure. I'm Dan Clark. I grew up in North Utica. I attended Notre Dame High School. My father was a firefighter. My mom was a school teacher. Both did their respective careers for 30 to 40 years. Unfortunately, my mom passed away in 2020, but she did get to see me in the Marine, and she found out that my youngest son was going to be born. So that was very, very important to me. Our relationship was always about family growing up, and I know that made her proud to see me succeed, not only in a career, but also in, life. So being the son of those two public service type workers, if you will, I had a strong sense and duty to want to give back to my community. You release your children in that kind of environment, it's natural for us to want to come back out and produce something similar to what our parents did, because we see the effect that they had on so many other people, not just their children. My family themselves, going back generations, can be traced back to military service in just about every single generation. Right now, I'm tracing roots back to one of my great-great-grandfathers who could have been on the Potomac with George Washington. I had family come straight over from the Netherlands in 1927. They were fleeing Nazis when they came into the Netherlands and started to kind of take a stronghold there. My great-grandfather, Peter Dam, was 17 years old when he fled, and unfortunately his brothers were captured and put into a concentration camp. However, they survived. They were liberated by the French, I believe. So at a very young age, he used to tell me this story when I would go take care of him. He lived right around the corner from our house, so he wanted to share his journey with his generations, and it kind of stuck. His one son, Peter, served in the Marine Corps and did 2 tours in Vietnam. And my Uncle Pete used to tell me stories only after I had enlisted in the Marine Corps about his time in Vietnam and seeing him open up about, his own military service after so many years was a profound experience. And honestly, it kind of shaped why I was able to open up about it further down the road. But regardless, you can see just every generation had some sort of military service, and it was a natural calling for me to want to do when I got out of high school. I deployed to Iraq in 2008, 2009. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. Going over to another country and seeing just how vastly different life is profound in its own sense, let alone during a wartime, experience.
You went into the Marines. You did your tour. How long were you in the Marines?
6 years. I got out as a sergeant in 2013.
And then you came out, you became a firefighter?
Yeah, I was living in Myrtle Beach at the time. I had switched to another unit down in South Carolina, and they had changed a lot of things in the Marine Corps at that time. And with that came a lot of changes as far as standards were considered. So I said, I'm going to take a step back and refocus my efforts into something a little bit more local. My father being a firefighter was a natural fit, so that's why I moved back to New York State.
So now you move back to New York, you become a firefighter. How long were you a firefighter?
7 years. I served from 2015, 2016 to 2023. I actually went out of work in 2022 in October. I was on one of the busiest ambulances in the United States at the city of Utica. There were a lot of rules that were made during the pandemic. There wasn't many people being hired. There wasn't very many people retiring just because there was no incentive. So the rule was the new guy basically had to be working on the ambulance. And there's no rotation. The senior half of the department kind of shielding themselves from it because it is grueling work. It's a lot. You're doing anywhere from 10 to 20-something calls in a 24-hour period. And then on top of that, you're being ordered back for another 10 or 14. So sometimes you're going 34, 38 hours on one of the busiest ambulances in the entire United States with no break. And I did that for 6 years.
I can only imagine the mental toll, not just physical toll, but the mental toll that would take for one person. I know a lot of people who are corrections officers, and I know what they're going through day to day to day. So I can only imagine what someone in your position would be, what kind of toll that would take on you.
Sure. And Utica is not a very easy place. We are one of a bigger immigrant type population. We once upon a time consider ourselves a cultural melting pot, and we very much are so. There's a lot of different countries coming to settle here because there's incentives for immigrants to settle here. However, the infrastructure didn't keep up. And when we don't take care of the infrastructure, if you will, the frontline service members are the ones that ultimately are paying that debt.
Dan, what point in your career, in your life, did you say, whoa, wait a minute, this is too much for me. I'm carrying a bigger load than I really should be carrying right now?
Sure. It was at the beginning of 2021. My wife is a nurse, and she was running an urgent care, and I was still running a lot on that ambulance. I couldn't sleep at night. I was tossing and turning all the time. I was having night terrors. So I had sought medications. I think they had started me on trazodone way back then, and that made things just exponentially worse. My night terrors became worse. I became much more agitated, and it just wasn't a pretty thing. So yeah, that was it. 21, when the world was attempting to reopen itself and then completely forgot about all the people that never stopped. That hurt me a lot.
Yeah, that's a heavy burden. You're not the only person that I've talked to just in my everyday life who said that so many things changed in that time period, and not some was good, but a lot of it was a test for so many people because some people were forgotten, some people weren't acknowledged enough, and things weren't handled the way that maybe they should have been handled.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I think one of the things that really put the nail in the coffin, if you would say, was the fact that it was expected of us to just roll that off our sleeve and keep going. I had mentioned earlier how they didn't have any of the hiring or any of that. So even though we had just got through the pandemic and we did all this frontline work and were rated as one of the busiest ambulances in the country, there was no acknowledgement of that, not just in a reward sense, but more of, hey, we got to get these guys and girls a break here. They've really got to decompress. In the military, there's this breakdown cycle afterwards. Even after a deployment, it's, a couple of months off, it's some decompression, it's some talk, but it's acknowledged that this is a time to drop the pack, refocus, and then, we'll gear back up, but you gotta take that break. There was no break, and there wasn't even an acknowledgement of it. And it was more of, all right, well, this is your job. You signed up for it. You better put left, right, left, or you're going to get left behind. That's just not something that you can do even on a physiological aspect, which is something that we're really starting to focus on more scientifically. And that led me into the next part of my life.
How did that impact your family life?
Oh, it was awful. Part of what I was doing was I was teaching my kids school when everything shut down. So, I'm going from seeing somebody's worst experience in their entire life, clocking out and going home and getting into 2+2 with a first grader. That was hard, was making that switch, just flipping it off from a care provider of the world's worst to a care provider for somebody who needs the world's best. And it was tough.
Without getting into too many details, how was your relationship with your wife at the time? What was she carrying because of what you were carrying?
That was extremely stressful. It's still extremely stressful. And, I'm going to be honest, we still go to couples therapy even today, and we haven't even processed the majority of the things that happened during the pandemic because it's hard to even put in the words, not necessarily just our experience between each other, but our experience with the world and then trying to relate it back to family sense.
A lot of people forget, yes, it's 2026, but it wasn't just 2020. It lingered for several years. All of the different regulations, all of the different emotional and mental and physical problems that came with the pandemic. We're not that far out from it. And I think a lot of us we still deal with some of the things that we experienced during the pandemic. No matter how big or small it was, it's still there for us. So I completely understand what you're saying. So you guys are in baby steps right now.
Absolutely. One of the best things that I had going for me was the fact that I was a veteran and got into the VA. And we learn a lot about our health because of the VA healthcare system. Syracuse University in upstate is one of the better burn foundations in the entire country. And that's because they worked with a lot of veterans who had gone through that type of experience. And, they were able to go back into the community and do that. Well, we're starting to do that now with the mental health aspect and specifically moral injury. It's not something that is very mainstream at the time about talking about those systemic betrayals that all of us have experienced. But what is that effect on the body? What is the physiological effect instead of just, the woo-woo, if you will?
Right. My father is a Vietnam veteran, and he has his health care predominantly through the VA and a lot of his care through the VA. And he's so grateful and thankful for what the VA has done. When you were ready to reach out for help, is the VA where you reached, or was there a different avenue to get the help that you needed to cope, or was it a mixture?
It was a little bit of a mixture, and I was very reserved about going to the VA to begin with. I had come home from Iraq with a broken ankle. Funny story, I was playing basketball on the last week of our deployment, and I just went the wrong way and snapped that ankle, So regardless, because it wasn't really a combat-related injury or such, it was kind of just pushed off, and I didn't really get the care that I needed. So they wanted me to go to the VA, and I'd gone to Albany and I had gone to Rome. And I think I was 5 minutes late for an appointment that I waited 6 months for through the Rome VA. And they're like, nope, you're going to have to schedule again. So that was in 2010. And, to go back to that experience, when I really needed the help, not just a basketball injury, I didn't know if I wanted to do that. My wife really pushed. What I did try to rely on was my resources of being a professional firefighter, because that's where I felt the majority of my injury had come from. But there was nothing there. We had a public service employee program, the EAP, if you will, Employee Assistance Program. That is, you call a phone number and they give you another phone number, and you call that phone number and you have to call another phone number. And it's just, you're continuing to call people with no answers. And then finally, when you do get an answer, it's, well, you're going to have to go to the same clinic that you were at last week picking up patients. And that's, when you're going through something as severe as PTSD with intrusive suicidal ideations, the last place you want to be is a place that you frequented at work. You want to go to an outside provider that may be even more sympathetic to your experience and not just generalized for the community. Regardless, after a series of phone calls, I worked with the IFF Center for Excellence, which is in Maryland. They had gave me a list of care providers that I can do outpatient therapy. One of the best things that everybody agreed on was for me to stay within that family dynamic. I didn't necessarily need to leave for a month, put my family behind, and be alone in something that was, just how I'm trying to process all this stuff, why I'm thinking this way, why I'm feeling this way. So they got in touch with this group, UFIT Counseling, which is in York Mills now. And actually, I send my kids there now because they're absolutely phenomenal. And the woman that I got hooked up with is Lori Myers. She is now doing a lot for first responders, and I swear by her. She got me through a really dark time, which was that first month of seeking help. And through that, she goes, you really should get yourself into the VA, because there are so many more resources that you're going to be opened up to that are going to help your recovery, because it's one thing just to work on the mind, but, I had these physical injuries as well. And in order to bring yourself in that more resonant, holistic state, if you will, you can't just fix one problem while ignoring the others. It's a simultaneous aspect. You got to take care of, body, mind, and spirit. That's when I got into the VA, was about January of 2023. And boy, did I hit the ground running with them. And boy, that's a life changer, but you have to buy in, whether it's through the VA or primary care or, whatever community service that may be out there. You have to buy in. You want to do the healing work, you really got to say, okay, this is real. This is my life. I need to, and I want to change. You have to have those things.
It's interesting to me. I think a lot of people look at all of those programs and therapy as sort of like this kind of one and done. Oh, let's put a time limit on it. Within the next year, I should be much better. But it really is sort of a lifetime. You're always working on it. You're always trying to bring yourself back. It's a continuous straight line to healing.
Yeah, I still go to therapy. Still, today I mentioned earlier that I'm still working on couples therapy with my wife. But on top of that, I'm still going to see a provider for just my own personal issues monthly. I was going every single week when this first started. So for me to just have one appointment for the entire month now, I consider a huge win in my life. But I doubt it will ever graduate past a yearly thing, because it's good just to have that mental health checkup, to bounce something off that's not in somebody in your immediate environment, a professional that is looking back things on a grander scale and saying, look at how far you came, look at where you are now, what are the things that we're still not addressing, what are the things that you're regressing into, which is, if we're not focusing on it, you're absolutely going to regress.
What do you wish people would understand more about mental health, and especially for first responders and veterans, and how that plays such a dynamic in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the research now is coming out where, people may experience these really tragic or profound events, if you will, maybe 3 to 5 times in their life, 10 on a really busy life. Frontline workers are 3, 4, 500 times in a career. And that includes volunteers. And volunteers themselves don't even get near as much credit for what they do. It's just kind of like, oh, well, you're not a professional, so I guess it can't really affect you. And that's not the truth. It's not just about the mind. It's a physiological effect on your entire system. You're going to end up being immunosuppressed, getting sick more often. I guarantee you the cancer rates are going to be higher because your body is an immunosuppressive state. So you're more susceptible to all of the extra environmental factors that we all normally are anyways. You can work out as much as you possibly want, but you can't outwork the brain. You can't outwork the experience. So unless you are able to take yourself out of that fight or flight mode, you're not going to be able to deal with it. You're not going to be able to get that body its rest that it needs in order to repair all those different cellular instructions within your system.
As we wrap up this conversation, I just have one last question that I really want to ask you. If there's somebody who's listening today who is really suffering in silence, they haven't taken the step to find some help or talk to someone, what's one thing that you want them to take away from this conversation that maybe will give them some hope?
You are not alone. You are not. And if somebody like me who was able to be the 1% of the 3%, that's the Marine Corps within the military, and I can come to address these things and, go into frontline service and run into burning buildings and put on the suit during the pandemic, that same experience, that same struggle, those same things that I felt and went through, you feel too, regardless of what that experience was. Those same feelings that I felt, you felt in your own unique experience. And that is no less of what I went through versus what you went through. So find that person, find the one person that you trust, because it just starts with one, and have the most real conversation of your life. Be true to yourself. Take care of your inner child. Treat that situation like 5-year-old you needs you today. And that's going to get the ball rolling. Everything after there starts after you do that.
Before we wrap up, I want to thank Dan for sharing such a deeply personal part of his journey. But we're not finished yet. In part 2 of our conversation, Dan shares what happened after he asked for help. We'll talk about the ongoing work of healing, how trauma affects families, the importance of community, and how he found a renewed sense of purpose through helping others. I hope you'll join me for part 2 of my conversation with Dan Clark. Thanks for listening to Real People, Real Lives. If today's story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and leave a review so you won't miss future episodes. And remember, every person has a story worth hearing. Until next time, take care.